welcome to Poetically Creative Mind podcast hosted by me, BM the Poet. This podcast is for people with a creative mind who need a little inspiration. I will be interviewing everyday people with creative minds, doing original poetry for myself and others, having inspirational conversation, and more. This podcast will be available wherever you get your podcast from. This next episode features the subject of suicide and suicide attempts. May be sensitive for some listeners. My next guest is an author and a poet. Struggling with personal trauma and mental health issues, he turned to poetry as an outlet for those emotions and feelings. Through his struggles, he hopes that his poetry can touch others to find a way through their struggles. His first book, Scars, takes a deep and personal look into events that shaped and changed his life. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you, Lucas Park. How are you doing this morning, sir?
Doing good, Brian. How are you? Thank you for having me.
Oh, I'm pretty wonderful myself. I really can't complain. Well, I can, but I'm not. So you know how that goes.
I know it.
Yeah. So for the people that don't know anything about you, could you tell the people a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, for sure. My name's Lucas Parks. I'm the author of Scars. And I grew up in an abusive home. And then I had some traumas sneak up along the way where I ended up stopping a after prom school shooting. And that was pretty traumatic. And we'll get more into that. As far as like my careers and stuff, I used to do construction, and then I was a mason for a long time. Then I became an underground miner. After that, I had what's known as a PTSD break, and that left me down and out on a journey searching for help. And eventually I found the help, glory to God. And I made it through those struggles, learned how to cope with them and make them more of a friend than an enemy.
Yeah, that is definitely important and life-changing as well.
Oh, absolutely.
So you talked about the situation that you stopped a shooting after prom.
Yeah, so getting into that a little bit, that was my big PTSD traumatic moment.
Yeah, I'm sure it was.
Oh, yeah. I could tell you a little bit about the story without getting into too much details. I don't want to offend anybody or trigger anything in anyone, but
yeah, please don't. If it's something that you don't want to talk about, please, we don't.
Oh no, I love sharing the story. It helps me heal to help others know that they're not alone in their struggles, and that it is a hard situation when you go through something traumatic. Long story short, there was this kid that I had known from school, and we hung out and partied together and drank and smoked weed together and stuff. And he ended up having a really bad situation at home where he wanted to kill himself and end his life. So for about 72 hours or so, I just walked around with him and tried talking him out of committing suicide. And I kept coming up with plans on how we could get him, get the gun away from him so that he wouldn't do it. And the plan I had was to drive up into the backwoods of Idaho and have a party and get drinking and just take the gun from him and empty the clip. And on the drive, he ended up saying, why don't we go up to that after prom party and I'll just start killing those kids that I don't like. And he named a few kids that I knew that had invited me to the party, but didn't invite him.
Wow.
And so going along with it in survival mode, I just said, yeah, sure, but we got to get some gas first. And we ended up pulling into this gas station, and I went in to call the police. And at the time, I was so afraid that he was already inside. When he walked out, I was walking in, and I couldn't even tell him. I was trying to tell him that I'm going to call my mom, but I just stuttered and mumbled everything. And I was just so afraid. And I walked in there and I asked the clerk, can I see your phone? She goes, yeah, what's the number? And this was before cell phones.
Yeah.
And she goes, yeah, what's the number? And I go, 911. And she thought I was joking. She laughed and she goes, no, seriously, what's the number? And I go, the kid that just walked out of here has a gun and he's going to kill himself. And,
wow.
And she ended up just giving me this look of fear and handing me the phone. And I dialed 911 and talked with the operator and got a cop down there. And there was another buddy with us. I ended up getting him to come inside. and we were walking around the gas station, and cop came in, and we knew him, and he asked Brian, the other kid that was there with me, he asked Brian, what has Cody got? And Brian couldn't talk because he was so scared. And I said that he's got a 9mm with hollow points. And the officer said, if you hear gunshots, get down and don't get back up until I come back in. And so Brian looked at me like, what should we do? And I just said, walk around, look like we're shopping. And then I heard the cop behind the truck talking to Cody, the shooter, and said, Cody, I hear you're having problems. We can get you help. And being that we all knew the cop, and like I said, small town, we all know each other, I felt like, okay, he's got this handled. So I peeked around the cigarette case and looked out the window. And at that time, the shooter waved at me, and then he cocked the gun, put it under his chin, and pulled the trigger.
Oh my
and then
goodness.
The clerk and the other kid that was in the store at the time, they came running over to me, and I grabbed them and I held them in my arms and fell to my knees. And the only thing I could think of was, how come I'm not crying? Shouldn't I be feeling something? Shouldn't I be sad about this? And Brian and the store clerk were just bawling, and they were shaking and shivering. And I was just in this numb haze. I didn't understand what was going on. And then I heard another gunshot. And at that time in my head, I had assumed that the cop just put the kid out of his misery. But I was like, cops don't do that. That don't make no sense. Later on, the kid ended up surviving his gunshot to the head. And I went to the hospital to talk to him, and he had his jaw wired shut and he couldn't talk. So he had to write everything down and tell me everything there. And he ended up telling me that he shot under his chin. He lost his tongue. He lost 8 teeth on his right side, lost his sinus, lost his right eye, and left a little bump where it looks like a pimple where the bullet was going to come out, and it never touched his brain. And then he was in shock, and he got out of the truck and tried to hand the gun to the cop, but because his body was reacting to the shock, he ended up shooting his leg. And so, yeah, he had a bullet in his leg. The cop ended up kicking the gun away from him and putting him on the ground, putting him in handcuffs, and then they took him to the hospital after that. And while the cops was trying to get our statements, I ended up seeing a bunch of the kids that he was talking about shooting driving by. And it was just so surreal at the moment. I didn't understand anything. I didn't know what was going on. I ended up getting back home. And I was, at the moment I got back home, and I was sitting on my porch, and I just out of nowhere broke down and just started bawling and crying. And I learned later in life that, that's what happens when somebody goes into the shock. They get this numb feeling and they don't understand what's happening or why it's happening. And everybody reacts to trauma differently.
Yeah.
And so that was my reaction at the time, was just to not feel anything or not understand anything. And
your body didn't process it.
Yeah, it was very hard to process, especially, being that I was the guy that was trying to talk him out of this moment of suicide. And then once he started talking about shooting other kids, I felt like it was just out of my hands, and I just had no control. And I'm sure you can relate, as a man, we feel like we have to fix things. And at that moment, there was nothing I could fix.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm now, I can understand where your PTSD and, having to live with dealing with that is tough.
Yeah, it's been a journey and a struggle to get past that. And, like I said, the kid's still alive. So living in a small town here, I run into him when we're shopping and stuff all the time. And it used to be that I ran into him and got scared and shook, and I got anxiety, and I couldn't handle being in the same store with him. And now when I see him there, it's just, I love him. I forgive him. I understand that he was suffering. I understand that he had issues he needed to deal with. And there's a lot of healing in that,
Yeah, and that's amazing for you to realize that was a part of your healing.
Oh yeah,
because even though you had it wasn't you who had anything to do with the act or the actions, you still took on all that grief and pain.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Of those actions.
Absolutely.
Wow. And
Yeah. And, growing up before that, I was always in an abusive home. I mean, for some examples, I lied to my mom one time. She threw me on the ground and kicked my teeth out. And then
wow.
there was another time that I was supposed to go to a tutoring class after school, but I had a teacher harping at me that I had to go film this Anne Frank video with some other classmates, and I was torn and I didn't know which way to go. So I went with the kids, and then I came home. My dad turned the music real loud and told the rest of my family to get out of the house, and he just whooped the crap out of me with a switch on my back, made me do push-ups, and every time I would fall, he would start over again, counting to 100.
Oh my.
And so, those are just some of the examples of the kind of abuse that I went through as a child.
I'm sorry you had
And
to deal with that.
yeah, and I was always funny and the class clown, and I always acted out in, what I would assume is a positive way of dealing with these traumas at home, because we did what I think most people who live in abusive homes do, is they project this perfect life on the outside, but there's this terrible evil happening inside the home.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And yeah, and that there's something to be said with child abuse, is through that, I never stopped loving my parents. I only stopped loving myself.
And that's horrible for that to happen from their horrible parenting.
Right. And, on the same note, I have forgiven them, and we are now best friends, and they have made great changes in their lives. And again, I have this knowledge and understanding that they were doing the best that they could have from the homes that they were raised in.
Yeah. And you have to take that into consideration as well.
Right. Absolutely.
Unfortunately, it was a tradition that they had passed on, but I'm glad to see that,
Yeah. And that's
everything has
another
gotten better for you and them.
Right. And one of the most positive things that I have taken from my past of child abuse is that they have taught me how not to be parents, as well as how to be a parent. None of my children have ever lived in that fear. None of my children have ever been hit or smacked or slapped or abused. That I have taken on the family lineage and decided this is where it stops.
Yeah, and that's what we have to do, it's more being aware.
Right.
You are aware of something and you made that change.
Right, exactly. If you never know it, how do you change it?
Yeah. And that's the biggest thing. And I spoke with the SC Anthony. We spoke about making changes like that.
Oh, cool.
And yeah, it's just crazy. But without all that trauma and abuse, you write some beautiful poetry from that.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, and that's my like most people that write poetry, it's a tool that we use to cope. And a year after the kid that shot himself, we ended up in the same mental hospital together. And it was odd because we hadn't talked for almost a year, 9 months or so. We didn't even communicate. I didn't hang out with him. I didn't want to associate with somebody like that.
Yeah.
And then I ended up started having flashbacks and having these weird dreams that were just scaring me, and I was waking up with anxiety. So I ended up calling the cop that showed up to the shooting, and he told me that I'm dealing with PTSD and I need to go to the hospital and see if I can't get some medication for it. So when I went into the hospital, they ended up pulling me aside and putting me in a room and closing the door. And one of the kids that was in there says, "This doesn't make any sense. They never do this to people." And then he peeked out the door and he goes, "Oh my God, there's a kid out there with one eye." And I knew automatically it was Cody.
Yeah.
So we ended up talking in group therapy with the counselors and stuff. And they said, because it's the anniversary date of when the shooting took place, that's why our minds were starting to slip. And we were having these flashbacks and this grief and anxiety and suicidal ideation and stuff. So while I was there, I ended up getting along with one of these counselors really good. And he told me to just start writing, just write and write and write and just get it out and don't let it set in you and become toxic. He goes, "It doesn't matter if anybody reads what you write, just You can take it and throw it away, or you can burn it. You can do whatever you want to, but just write and just get it out of you. So for years, I just liked to write, and I just thought that was just kind of fun. And I'm dyslexic and very illiterate. I have a sixth grade education, and I'm a ninth grade dropout. So none of my spelling was right. I definitely didn't want to share it with anybody. But then years later, I got with my now wife, and she would take note that when I was having anxiety or having an issue, I would just stay up all night in the quiet, and I would just write and write and write. And one day she asked to see my writing, and I handed it to her, and she read it, and she goes, "This is poetry." And I just laughed at her, and I'm like, "Come on, I'm dyslexic. I can't even spell. Like, I can barely read." I'm like, this is not poetry." And then she showed me Edgar Allan Poe and his dark poetry, and I was like, wow, this is poetry. You're right. So I finally mustered up the courage to post something on Facebook. And the first thing I posted on Facebook got over like 300 reactions or something. And I was just like, I saw this way of helping others heal, knowing that my trauma and my testimony could actually reach somebody else out there that feels like they're the only ones dealing with this. This is the only feeling, like this is the oh, I don't know the word I'm looking for, but the loneliness and the anxiety and the feeling like nobody can relate. Everybody's saying, just get over it. You're fine. Like you're not fine. And that's
people
okay
who
to not be fine.
don't deal with this on a life basis. I wouldn't even say a day-to-day basis. It's a life basis.
Yeah.
They will never understand.
Mm-hmm.
Get over it.
Exactly.
It's easy for someone to say, but it's almost impossible to do.
Oh yeah,
and
absolutely.
You try. It's not like you're not putting in the effort.
Right.
The effort is what keeps you going. It's what keeps you alive.
Right.
So, I definitely understand where you're coming from with a lot of what you're saying.
Oh, thanks. That's awesome. Yeah.
So
yeah. Go ahead.
Now you go ahead.
All right. I was just going to say with my book and everything, it's really it's a way of expressing all the trauma that I went through. And it's a 7-part series. So Scars is the first book of 7, and it's going to be the darkest moments, the darkest period of my life. And it's going to move and transition to the last book, which is going to be called Glory. And that's the healing. That's the whole journey at the end. That's how God came in my life and transformed me and made me feel better. And I know a lot of people struggle with believing in a God, but for me, it's, if it works, does it matter?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that.
Yeah.
I'm all about believing whatever helps you.
Exactly. And I'm with that too. And there's times that I hated the idea of a God. Oh, I would curse him. I'd cuss at him. I just hated the idea that there was a God. But I feel like a guy that can create a whole universe and a planet and all these people in it with the animals and the trees, he can handle my little bit of anger, my little bit of fit.
Yeah. And he understands that you're capable of handling it.
Right.
And, he understands the weight that you can bear.
Exactly.
And regardless of how much he puts on you, he knows you're going to bear it and mold that weight into something.
Yeah.
So yeah, I definitely. So let's dive in a little bit more into the book.
Okay.
Because as we spoke earlier, I told you one of my favorite poems was called Stepfather, and especially with you coming from an abusive background. That also stood out to me that you could write a poem that beautiful.
Oh, thank you.
The situation that you dealt with.
Yeah.
So tell me, how did that come about?
So that was actually when, again, my wife had told me that this is poetry, and I wanted to kind of step away from just writing about my trauma and writing about all the dark things in my life and see if I couldn't write something about the positivity in my life. And when I got with my wife, she had a child from a previous relationship, and just thinking about her, thinking about my stepdaughter and the way that she needed to be treated and the way she needed to be raised, it really gave me the words and the courage and the motivation to try to write something about being a stepfather and how that feels. And that's where the motivation came for stepfather.
That is beautiful, because you stepping into a role that somebody else abandoned, knowing you
Yeah.
don't have to, or you can, your ties to that isn't that significant, but you choose to make that. To me, that's beyond what a man can be.
Oh, thank you. That means a lot. Gives me chills when you said that.
Because at one time in my life, I tried to step into a role like that.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the relationship didn't progress, but just like you, it was a choice that I know I'm making, and I want to make this choice. And, not everybody can do that. And there are a lot of men that have, and that's something to be proud of. And
Oh,
like I said, that was one of my favorite poems that you wrote, just because of the fatherhood aspect of it more than anything.
oh, that's awesome. Thank you. It means a
Hey,
lot.
you took on a
Yeah.
role
And
that you didn't have to, and
yeah. Yeah. And I always think of the mental health of the children and what they need, and I always make sure that her father's involved in her life. I treat him like a friend. I feel like we have enough hate in this world and we could use a lot more love. And if we could just put aside jealousy or past or the way people treated people, we could just love and focus on what is actually important. And I believe that it is easier to raise good children than to try to fix broken adults.
oh man, it's powerful words. Yeah, because the children, I've said this multiple times, and I'm gonna say it again, children's mental health is extremely important.
Absolutely.
We
Couldn't
may
agree
not,
more.
they are people, just a little version of us.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So I love hearing people talk about mental health for kids, because it'll make a better adult.
Yeah. Yeah. It's true. And that's something I love about my wife is she works at a daycare that my mother owns, but she's pursuing a career in child psychology. And it just seems like me and her are the perfect match with me having all these issues from childhood and her passion is just to help these kids. It just seems like the perfect fit.
Yeah, that's crazy that you say that, because my wife, she didn't do a child psychology, but that's what she got her master's in, and it's like you're almost perfect to kind of deal with who I am.
Oh, that's
It's
awesome.
rare when you find somebody that's perfect to deal with, to deal
Yeah.
and understand who you are and
Oh,
what you
yeah.
have to go through, because
Yeah.
it's not easy
No, no.
dealing with somebody that deals with mental health issues
Oh,
and
no. It
other
takes a
issues as
strong
well.
person.
Yeah. And those are
Yeah.
strong people to deal to want to deal with other people's minds all the time. And
Right.
yeah,
Yeah. That's like I've had many past failed relationships, and that is one thing that I love about my wife is she looks into things and understands things. One of my bad habits with past relationships is I'd always push people away and kick them out and just tell them to leave me alone or get pissed off and scream and cuss at them, break things around the house. And I just didn't understand why I had so much rage and anger. But too, at the time, I also didn't understand that the PTSD was very real and happening. And so, for instance, one time I kicked my wife out right around Christmas, and she came back to me with all this literature saying, I don't think you understand what you're doing. She said that people who have been traumatized are no longer wired for connection like we're supposed to be. We're wired for protection. And so, as an act of survival in the fight or flight stage, kicking her out is for my survival. You can't hurt me if you're not here, because the people I loved the most in my life had hurt me the most.
yeah. Oh yeah. So you were being very protective of yourself.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that is. Yeah, man. That mental health, and It is something serious.
Yes, sir. Yeah, and that's another thing too is after my stay at the mental hospital when I was a kid, I ended up, focusing on career. Once I got out of there, I thought, oh, I'm stronger than this mental health. I'm fine. I can just push it aside and just live my life. And I went a long time just building a career and, getting into the mining industry and it seemed like there was no problem, but looking in hindsight, I was always angry. I was always mad. I was always drinking. I was always smoking weed. I was always doing something to escape from the reality. And what had happened was years later, I had what's known as a PTSD break. And that was where the body just finally says, enough is enough. We have to take care of this. And it was terrible. It went from PTSD to complex PTSD. I was sick all the time. I was throwing up. I couldn't get off the couch. The only thing that made me feel any better was smoking weed. So in Idaho,
Yeah.
I started growing it in my closet illegally. Then the Washington legalized weed. So I moved over there, started working on cannabis farms over there. I got into high times and stuff. I got really motivated thinking that this weed was going to cure me. But every once in a while, the weed wouldn't work anymore. It stopped working, and I would start dealing with all of these issues again. And then I wouldn't understand it. So then I'd go get checked into the hospital again. And I'd been into the hospital probably 6 or 7 times. And
Wow.
it seemed like all they would do is try to push pills down my throat. But the pills
That,
I'd have terrible side effects from, and nothing
yeah.
would work.
Yeah, that's what they do.
Yeah, but there wasn't any real genuine help. There wasn't any internal work. It was just take these pills and cover it up. And so I am a supporter of weed, and I believe that there is help with weed. I I just don't believe that it is the answer. It's not the cure. The cure is inside of us. The cure comes from within.
Man, you sound like I sound like I'm hearing myself speak those words because I agree with everything you just said.
That's awesome.
Because I am a advocate for marijuana as well.
Yeah,
But I also know that it's only there to, I wouldn't even say cope. It just
yeah,
helps you
yeah,
but it's still an internal thing that's you have to work on,
yeah.
and it's
And I
going to
heard
be a
this.
continuous work.
Yeah, I heard this PhD psychologist say one time, and it really stuck with me. It said the reason that weed works so good for people with PTSD is because forgetting well is just as important as remembering well. And people with trauma remember too well.
Yeah, yeah. And the thing about remembering too well, a lot of times it comes when you're trying to sleep.
Oh, the demons always come to fight in the middle of the night. Oh,
Oh
man.
my goodness. I
When
don't know
you're
how
alone
many
with your
times
thoughts.
I woke up screaming and
Yeah.
ready to fight, or
Yeah. I know those
it's just,
feelings all too well, man.
yeah. So, like I said, a lot that you speak, I see a lot in myself, especially in your words. When I read so many of your poems, it's like, man, that's me.
Yeah. Well, that's what
So,
Scar's about. It's about helping people relate to see that we're not the only ones dealing with mental illness, and
yeah,
we can get our emotions out. We can share with others. Again, like I said, I am a believer in God, and one of the scriptures I love is confess your sins unto one another. Now, it might not be a sin to be in the trauma, but to me, it convicts me to hold it in and not share it with anybody. Like, who am I to deny the glory of God that has healed me?
yeah, yeah.
And there was a moment that God really intervened with my life, and He really touched me. I ended up screaming and yelling. Me and my ex were living in Spokane, Washington, and that's when I was working on the cannabis farms. And I just had a really bad night, and I stayed up all night, and I was sleep deprived, and I ended up yelling and screaming at her and told her to get the fuck out of the house and leave me the fuck alone. And I ended up taking my brother's shotgun, and I racked one in the chamber. I put it under my chin, and I had to put aside all my fears of, is there a heaven? Is there a hell? Is this right? Is this wrong? Am I going to hurt my family? I just put it all aside, and I felt like I will never get over this trauma. I am a burden. And I took a deep breath, and I pulled the trigger, and click, the bullet never came out. And then I got mad, and I did it. I cocked it again and clicked it again. And then I started smashing the shotgun on the ground, and I was trying to make it misfire, do whatever. I was so tired of being tormented. And again, this was a time that the weed wasn't working. So I felt like there is no cure for this. I am just going to be fucked up for the rest of my life. And I just started smashing that gun. And eventually I just gave up, and I became restless, and I laid down and I fell asleep. And I ended up going to my neighbor the next day, and I asked him, could you fix my shotgun? Could you clean it out? And I still had the intent to kill myself. And I gave him that shotgun, and he racked one in the chamber, pointed it down, and the bullet came out no problem. And at that moment, I just saw that Jesus was sitting next to me, and he had his finger in that chamber, and he wasn't letting that go off because, I got this poetry to write. I got a story to share, and I got to let people know that it's real. Like, there is somebody out there that can heal you, but it's not who you think. It's not your neighbor. It's not your friend. It's not your buddy. It's not your wife. It's not your spouse. It's a divine within you that can heal you.
Yeah. That's where it comes from.
Yeah.
It wasn't meant to be.
Absolutely.
That was one of those life-changing moments where you realize there's more for me than what I thought.
Yeah. And at that moment, it was right at the peak of all of the trauma, the journey of healing. It was at the worst of the worst that I just felt, this is it. And I just became hopeless. I didn't have any hope left. I just thought, I've asked this God you people speak of so many times to heal me, and he won't. And if you know Paul in the Bible, there's a time when Paul asked God, he said, can you remove this thorn? God said, I cannot remove that thorn, but my grace is sufficient enough. And at that, reading that, I feel like Paul's thorn, because he was a martyr of Christians, Paul's thorn was PTSD. And God couldn't take away the things that he has seen and the things that he has done, but he can love us enough. He can give us enough grace and mercy that we can make it through these traumatic events.
Yeah, I definitely understand that. One thing I've learned, and what has truly helped me, is acceptance.
Yes.
Because we want to fight to change it, and we're going to continue to fight to change it. But you still have to, once you accept that it's what it is,
right?
You take its power away from it.
Oh, absolutely.
And accepting
100% agree with that.
Is the biggest thing I've learned out of everything I've done. Every word that someone has told me, every word that I've written or read, is that you have to accept it. And until then, it will beat you.
Oh, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. That is the truth. Speaking about my wife, who is so into psychology and she wants to figure all these problems out and what are the solutions to these problems, she found me a therapy called EMDR. And in the past, I had tried it, but it didn't work for me. But this time I was willing to try it again. And this time I decided to quit smoking weed so that I could go into it with a clear mind and not leaning on a crutch.
Yeah.
And when I went into it, acceptance was a very big part of it. It was a very big realization to realize that I have these traumas and I see them and I accept them and they're okay. And they made me a part of who I am today.
Yeah.
And that was very healing.
Yeah. It sometimes just takes that simple moment.
Absolutely. Just like you said, acceptance. That is one of the biggest tools anybody could use to get over a trauma, is accept your trauma. Tell your trauma that I see you and I accept you, but I am not you.
And the thing about with accepting, it changes. So you have to continuously be willing to accept those changes.
Right. Right.
because you never know what it's going to give you day to day.
Oh, absolutely.
So you just have to be willing to accept every change that comes and just roll with it like a roller coaster, like one of the poems that you have. I forget the
Yeah.
specific name, but
Yeah.
I,
Emotional roller coaster.
yeah.
Yeah. Roller coaster of emotions. Absolutely. That's the name of that one.
So what more can we find in your book Scars?
There's a lot to relate to. Like I said, it is a 7-part series. It has a lot of Easter eggs, a lot of hidden messages. For instance, just trying to get my point across here, there's a poem I have called Hidden in a Haiku, and it's about my wife. And if you can find it, her name is actually spelled out in there multiple times. There's a lot of acronyms and stuff that I like to work with. And also, being that it's a 7-part series, I have a lot in books that follow the next books that have to do with what's coming. So as people keep up with the series, they're going to start seeing things that reflect back to Scars in the next book. Right now, I'm working on Infection, which is the second book. And Infection is going to be very much about hate and society and the way that people say we're supposed to be, and the anger that we have towards people, and the fear that we all hold inside. Whereas Scars is about love, death, and time.
Yeah.
And again, like I was saying, a lot of hidden messages. If you do look through the book, you'll see where a lot of times love or death or time is highlighted in the color scheme of the book. And
Yes,
that's because
that's something I noticed as well. I love that about it because that, to me, that gives it those words emphasis. Well, for me, when I see that in red, it gave the that word more emphasis.
right. Yeah. Another thing I like to do with my writing is I like to compare things that are not entities as entities. So as you're reading through the book, you'll see that towards the end of it, all the love, death, and time that was highlighted leads to poems like She is Time, She is Love, and She is Death. And these 3 different poems reflect all of the book. That when you then go back and read the poem again, you'll realize that love is actually an entity, and death is an entity, as well as time is an entity.
Yeah. So would you like to read that poem for us?
Oh, I kind
But
of like to
not,
leave that one a mystery for whoever reads the book.
okay.
There was a poem I would like to recite, which is called A Selfish Suicide. And the reason I really wanted to read this one is because it's very controversial. And when I put it out there on Facebook for people to read, I get negative comments and I get positive comments. And a lot of people can understand where I'm coming from. And then other people just don't understand it at all. I know that I've been to a lot of funerals where someone has committed suicide, and it seems like the pastor always says it is selfish to commit suicide. And that really burdens and bothers me because I have been suicidal and I have had the ideation. And it's, to me, takes a lot of courage to actually kill yourself, not knowing what's on the other side, to face the fear of the unknown. And I believe what is selfish is depression. Depression is like a wound. And if you have a
Mhm.
cut on your arm, you focus on the cut. The same thing with depression. But so many people that commit suicide, they feel like they are a burden to their family and their friends and their loved ones. And I just like that it is controversial, and I get the positive and negative because I just love that we're squashing the stigma. We're talking about it. That to me is
Yeah,
important.
definitely.
And so I'm going to read it here, and bear with me because, like I said, I am illiterate. So if I stutter on my words, forgive me.
No problem.
It says, A selfish suicide. They say suicide is selfish. Do they know what hell is? They say, you can bear this. Do they ever try to relish? They say, it's all for attention. Can they feel the tension? They say, there's no help for this. But have you ever felt depression? They say, it will get better. Yet have they ever felt the weather? They say, stay strong. Have they ever fought for so long? They say, move on. But have they ever been wronged? They say, it's not that bad. Have they ever given it all they had? They say, you got this. Have they ever felt so hopeless? And I must agree, suicide is selfish. If you see someone hurting and you do nothing to help this.
Man, that is deep.
Yeah.
And to me, it could help someone kind of understand why someone would, especially if you
Yeah.
haven't experienced, like I said, if someone hasn't experienced that, they really can't judge and understand how a
Right.
person how a person would feel, and
Right.
how you know, you think your burden is holding people back, and
Absolutely.
that would release them, even though it may not. But in your mind doesn't, your mind is doing its own thing. It's not, the wires are across. So,
Yeah.
so yeah, I can definitely understand and see why some people wouldn't.
Oh yeah, I've had some pretty negative comments about it, and I've also had some pretty common or positive comments about it. And what I've noticed too is a lot of the people that have had like their children commit suicide or a family member commit suicide, they have the positive comments. But like you were saying, the people who don't understand, they just don't understand, and they are the ones with the negative comments.
But that's the great thing about your poetry. It helps bring people together to talk about those situations. It
Absolutely.
helps to bring understanding
Yeah.
and
Yeah, and I
helps
think it's
somebody to
also
maybe want to do something.
yeah. And I also think it's very thought provoking. If I can just get you thinking about it, then maybe we can make positive changes, you know.
And
For
that's what it's about.
the people that don't understand, I would hate for them to treat their suicidal child or a suicidal friend as I have been treated, where again, like the poem says, they say just get over it. Like you can't just get over crossed wires.
Yeah. And like I said, it'll bring conversations to light that people tend to stay away from.
Yeah.
Even though it happens often, people still want to try and stay away from those conversations. But that's that's a beautiful thing about poetry. It can make those conversations easier to talk about.
Right. Right. And that's another thing about the book Scars. In the dedication, it's actually dedicated to stigma as kind of a fuck you to stigma. Like we shouldn't have this stigma anymore. We should be freely talking about it. I think the people that do commit suicide are the people that can't talk about it. The soldiers that will get vetted if they speak up and say, I'm dealing with something. Those are the people that we need to reach out to and be able to say it's okay to talk about this stuff.
It's okay to have those feelings.
Yeah,
Let's just not move forward on them.
right.
You know,
Exactly.
many people think about I wouldn't say committing suicide, but the effects of their suicide,
Yeah,
as a way of probably not even going through with the act because they know how that would distort other people's lives.
right, right.
So
And committing suicide is very much a contagious way of spreading suicide. I, I know when, years ago there was a kid here who had committed suicide, and within the year it seemed like three other kids committed suicide, and it really seemed like they were all friends, and it had something to do with that. Kind of like with my ex and stuff, I used to say, and I still say it today, that PTSD is only contagious for your spouse because of the way you treat them and the way you act out and the way that you yell and scream and break things. And again, like you said, it takes such a strong person to be in a relationship with somebody with a mental health issue.
yeah, like I said, when you're dealing with mental health and you have kids around, it's
Mm.
you really have to learn to you really become more self-aware
Oh, absolutely.
because your kids will tell you who you are
Amen to that,
through
right?
what you see them doing. Like, oh, okay,
Yeah,
wow,
yeah,
okay,
yeah. And that's one
change, time
thing,
to make
bro.
a change.
Yeah, yeah. One thing I learned through growing up in with the the rage and the anger and the anxiety that I've had is I've realized that, from getting whooped or getting my teeth kicked out or any of these issues, I can watch those scars heal, but it's the words that they said that I can't watch heal. It's all that internal damage that they did,
Yeah.
the emotional abuse. That's one of the hardest things to heal from.
Yeah, because it sticks and it's on a loop in your head.
Absolutely.
Well, there's a poem.
That's a good one. It feels to be somebody who's willing to talk about mental health and stuff. And it's that I have this thing inside of me that is dark and people don't really want to talk about it. And it's very stigmatic and we want to just keep it away and just push it away and not talk about it. But being willing to talk about it, I now have this, this tapping raven, this crow that are my thoughts that go deeper than being afraid to speak about mental health.
Yeah, because mental health is slowly being put on the forefront of one of a big mental health issue.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people suffer from it, some knowingly and some unknowingly.
Right.
So
I can agree
we'll
with that.
just continue to keep the battle going, because
Amen.
it's
Amen.
never going to end.
It ain't. Nope. It's always going to be there. And they say with the COVID stuff where we were all isolated and everything, it's going to get worse, and the suicide rates have already gone up and stuff. And I think it's a good time to squash the stigma and be somebody that someone can come and talk to, as well as don't be afraid to talk.
Yeah, and even if you don't want to talk, if you have a creative bone in your body, show it through your creativity. If you sew, you cook, you write, anything you can do to get that out of you and not let it fester in you, because again, that's one of the most important things, is getting it out.
Oh yeah.
And you'll be amazed at what you can do with that pain and that anger and that fear.
Amen. Yes, that is the truth.
No, please get it out of you. Don't let it just sit in there. But I greatly appreciate you for joining me.
Yeah, thank you for having me on.
Oh man, you're more than welcome. I look forward to your next book in the series.
Awesome.
Because if it's anything like Scars, we're going to be in for another treat.
Thank you.
Another emotional roller coaster. I have more tears to bear on the next book as well.
Awesome.
And once I get through this one, I'm sure I'll be to shed a few more.
Oh, good deal. Well, then we could share some more time too, I hope, on the next podcast.
Oh, definitely. Again, thank you for joining me. And
please follow me at
BM
the Poet on Instagram and BM the Poet on Twitter. Please rate it 5 stars, subscribe, and share. Have a good evening.